She stood before the garage, her white linen dress collecting the dust of the road, her hand clutching a blank invoice. "No charge?" Her voice was thin with disbelief. The man wiped his hands on a stained rag, his gaze unnervingly calm. "You look like you need the car more than I need the money." The smell of engine oil mingled with her expensive perfume, a bizarre contrast between their two worlds. On his wrist, a weathered leather cord, its edges frayed, and she recognized it with a jolt that felt like a theft of breath. The last birthday gift for an employee she never had the chance to say goodbye to. He didn't know her name. She didn't dare speak the name of the dead woman. A car repaired for free. What felt like a stranger's kindness was, in fact, the line drawn between two people at opposite ends of a great loss, about to pull them both into the vortex of a buried truth. The jolt came without warning, a metallic screech that tore through the curated silence of her luxury sedan. Claire Whitmore's hands clenched the leather-wrapped steering wheel, her heart hammering against her ribs. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across a part of the city she rarely drove through, all low-slung brick buildings and faded storefronts. A flat tire. On the one day her schedule was a house of cards, stacked so precariously that a single breath of disruption could bring it all down. At 42, as the head of human resources for a pharmaceutical giant, Claire's life was a masterclass in controlled variables. This, a hiss of escaping air and a pronounced limp to the driver's side, was an infuriating, unwelcome anomaly. She was already late for the quarterly review, a meeting where careers were subtly made or unmade in the sterile quiet of a boardroom. She guided the car to the curb, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the ruined tire, a mocking drumbeat. A quick scan of the street revealed no gleaming, corporate-approved auto shops, only a small, unassuming garage halfway down the block. Ross's Auto Repair, the sign read in faded blue letters. It looked like a relic from another era, a place where things were fixed with hands and intuition, not diagnostic computers. With a sigh of resignation that felt more like a concession of defeat, she gathered her composure, stepped out of the air-conditioned bubble of her car, and walked toward the open bay door. The heat of the pavement rose through the soles of her expensive heels, and the smell of gasoline and hot asphalt was a stark assault on her senses, a world away from the filtered air and subtle citrus scent of her office. Inside the garage, a man was bent over the exposed engine of a pickup truck, his back to her. Sunlight, thick with dancing dust motes, streamed in from the high windows, illuminating the organized chaos of tools hanging on pegboards and the dark, greasy stains on the concrete floor. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the fabric of his simple gray t-shirt. He moved with a quiet efficiency, a focused grace that seemed to absorb the ambient noise of the garage. When she cleared her throat, he straightened up slowly, turning to face her. Daniel Ross was 38, though the faint lines around his eyes suggested a life that had demanded more from him than his years. He wasn't smiling, but his expression was open, his gaze steady. It was the gaze of a man who was accustomed to solving problems, not creating them. Claire explained her predicament, her voice a little too sharp, a little too formal for the setting. She gestured toward her car, a silver beacon of corporate success now humbled by a simple piece of road debris. Daniel listened patiently, his eyes briefly flicking from her face to the car and back again. He didn't seem impressed by the vehicle's make or her impeccably tailored suit. He only saw the problem. He nodded once, a simple, decisive gesture. "Pull it in," he said, his voice a low baritone that was surprisingly gentle. "I'll take a look. Shouldn't take long to patch if the rim's not bent." He worked with a practiced ease, his movements economical and sure. In less than 20 minutes, the spare tire was on. the ruined one stowed in her trunk. It was an interlude of unexpected competence in a day rapidly unraveling. When he was finished, he wiped his hands on the rag tucked into his belt and walked into the small, cluttered office to write up an invoice. Claire followed, pulling her wallet from her handbag, ready to pay whatever he asked, just to be on her way. The office was an extension of the garage, a scarred wooden desk, a whirring fan in the corner, and the pervasive scent of oil. But on the corner of the desk, propped against a mug full of pens, was a small, framed photograph. It was a picture of a woman with a wide, infectious smile and kind eyes, her head tilted slightly, as if sharing a secret with the camera. A young girl, no older than 8, was perched on her lap, her arms wrapped around the woman's neck. There was a flicker of something in Claire's memory, a faint, ghost-like recognition that she couldn't quite grasp. The woman's face was familiar, but in the way a stranger you pass on the street sometimes is. Daniel slid the invoice across the desk. It was blank in the space where the total should have been. Claire looked at it, then back at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. That was when he spoke the words that disarmed her completely. "You look like you need the car more than I need the money." The statement was so simple, so devoid of artifice, that it left her speechless. It wasn't pity, it was an observation, a quiet act of grace from a man in a grease-stained shirt to a woman in a linen dress. She insisted, her corporate instincts rebelling against the idea of an unrecorded transaction, of an unpaid debt. But he just shook his head, a faint smile finally touching his lips. "Just pay it forward sometime," he said. As she stood there, flustered and strangely moved, her gaze fell again to the photograph. The woman's smile seemed to hold a question she couldn't answer. She drove away from the garage with a perfectly functional car, but her mind was no longer on the missed meeting. It was on a stranger's kindness, the faint scent of engine oil that now clung to her clothes, and the unnerving, lingering image of a familiar face she was certain she should know. The memory of the garage, with its scent of oil and honest labor, followed Claire back into the sterile, climate-controlled environment of her high-rise office. The missed meeting had earned her a passive-aggressive email from her superior, Marcus Thorne, but for the first time in years, a minor corporate reprimand felt entirely insignificant. She found herself staring out the panoramic window, the city sprawling below like a complex circuit board, yet her mind was fixed on a small, framed photograph on a cluttered desk. The woman's smile. It was a genuine, unguarded expression that felt out of place with the nagging familiarity it evoked. It wasn't just a face she'd passed in a hallway. It was a face she felt she should know, connected to a name that hovered just beyond her grasp. The feeling was a persistent hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, a cognitive dissonance she couldn't ignore. She told herself it was the unusual kindness, the unexpected encounter, that had unsettled her. But a deeper instinct, one she had learned to trust in her profession, insisted it was something more. That evening, unable to focus on the quarterly reports spread across her polished dining table, Claire succumbed to the urge. She opened her laptop, the glow of the screen casting a cool light in her quiet apartment. With a few clicks, she logged into the company's extensive personnel archives, a digital vault of every employee, past and present. She didn't know the woman's last name, so she started with a vague search, filtering by first names. Anna. Dozens of profiles appeared, a sea of corporate headshots. She scrolled through them, her heart beating a little faster with each click. And then she found it. Anna Ross. The same wide smile, the same kind eyes, though the photograph was a professionally lit, less candid version of the one in Daniel's office. The profile was inactive, the employment status marked as terminated. Claire's breath caught in her throat. Anna Ross had been an administrative coordinator in the Research and Development Division. She had worked for the company for 6 years, and her direct reporting line, for the final 2 of those years, had been to Claire Whitmore. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, washed over her. She clicked deeper into the file, her fingers moving with a morbid, detached precision. The termination date was listed, October 23rd, 2 years ago. The reason cited was corporate restructuring, a sterile, impersonal phrase that Claire herself had written and approved countless times. It was the corporate euphemism for downsizing, a necessary evil she had long ago made peace with. Her digital signature was at the bottom of the form, a crisp, undeniable confirmation of her role. A quick search in a new browser tab for the name and the date brought up a small, local news brief. A single car accident on a rain-slicked highway. The driver, Anna Ross, had been pronounced dead at the scene. The date of the accident was October 26th. 3 days. 3 days after Claire had signed the papers that ended her career, Anna Ross had died. The guilt was instantaneous and suffocating, a physical weight pressing down on her chest. She remembered the restructuring now. It had been brutal. A list of names had come down from Marcus, the directive absolute. Cut 15% of departmental staff before the end of the fiscal year. She had argued for some, but Anna's name had not been one she'd fought for. She had been just a name on a spreadsheet, a line item to be deleted. Claire tried to rationalize it, a desperate attempt to build a wall against the rising tide of self-recrimination. It wasn't her decision, not really. Marcus Thorne had made the final call, his logic driven by cold metrics and shareholder appeasement. She was merely the instrument, the one tasked with the grim mechanics of the process. This was the story she told herself, the red herring she threw into the dark waters of her conscience to distract from the larger, more monstrous truth. But the defense was flimsy, and she knew it. She had held the power. She had signed the form. She remembered Anna vaguely now, a quiet, efficient presence in meetings, someone who always had her work done on time, who never caused any trouble. A model employee, right up until the moment she became expendable. Claire felt a sudden, powerful urge to go back to the garage. She told herself it was to pay the man for his work, to correct the imbalance of the transaction, but she knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that she was being drawn back by the gravity of her own hidden complicity. She drove there the next afternoon, a crisp $100 bill tucked into her wallet. Daniel was in the same spot, working on a different vehicle. The rhythmic clank of his tools a steady, comforting sound. He seemed surprised to see her, a faint crease appearing between his brows. She held out the money, explaining that she couldn't accept his generosity, her voice more strained than she intended. He looked at the money, then at her, and slowly shook his head. "I told you, it's fine, but I appreciate it." He seemed to sense her unease and gestured toward a pair of stools near his workbench. "Coffee?" he offered. She found herself agreeing, sitting on the worn stool, feeling utterly out of place in her tailored blazer. He spoke about his daughter, Lucy, and about the challenges of running the garage alone. And then, as if sensing the question she was too afraid to ask, he mentioned his wife. He spoke of Anna's passion for her work at the pharmaceutical company, how much she had believed in its mission. But he also spoke of the pressure, how in the last year she had grown distant, often coming home late, her shoulders tight with a stress she refused to name. "She started keeping things from me," Daniel said, his gaze distant, lost in a memory. "Said it was just work stuff, things I wouldn't understand. I guess I should have pushed harder." Each word was a small, sharp blow to Claire's carefully constructed composure. She was listening to the aftershock of a decision she had made in a sterile office 2 years ago. The consequences were not a line on a report, but a grieving husband and a motherless child. The secret burned in her throat, a toxic, unswallowable truth. Then he looked at her, his expression one of simple curiosity. "So, what is it you do? You seem a long way from downtown." The question was a landmine. The truth was impossible. It would detonate everything. The lie came easily, a reflex born of years in a world where information was currency and vulnerability was a liability. "I'm a freelance consultant," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "I help small businesses streamline their operations." It was close enough to her skill set to be plausible, yet a universe away from the reality of her position. She had just planted a seed, a lie that she knew would have to be tended, watered, and protected. As she left the garage for the second time, the $100 bill still in her wallet, she was no longer just a woman with a guilty conscience. She was a liar, actively deceiving the man whose life she had unknowingly, irrevocably altered. The lie Claire told Daniel had a life of its own, a shadowy presence that now occupied a permanent space in her thoughts. It wasn't just a single falsehood. It was a foundation upon which every subsequent interaction with him was built, each one adding another layer of precarious deceit. She found herself manufacturing reasons to be in his part of town, inventing phantom clients for her consulting business that required her to drive past the garage. She would slow down, a knot of guilt and a strange, unidentifiable longing tightening in her stomach, hoping for a glimpse of him or his daughter. Her meticulously organized life, once a fortress of professional obligations and predictable routines, now had this wild, unkempt garden of a secret growing in its center. The guilt was no longer a sharp, acute pain, but a dull, constant ache. It was a weight she carried into boardrooms and onto conference calls, the memory of a grieving man's words about his wife's hidden stress echoing over the drone of corporate jargon. Her fabricated errands eventually led her, as she knew they would, to the elementary school just a few blocks from Ross's auto repair. She parked across the street shortly before 3 o'clock, telling herself she was simply waiting for the traffic to die down. It was a weak excuse, and she didn't even try to believe it. The schoolyard was a vibrant explosion of noise and color as the final bell rang. Children spilled out of the doors, their backpacks bouncing, their voices high and excited. She saw him almost immediately. Daniel was leaning against the chain-link fence, his work clothes setting him apart from the other parents. He wasn't looking at his phone. His attention was fixed on the school entrance, a soft, expectant look on his face. A moment later, a little girl with her mother's eyes and a cascade of brown hair came running out, her face lighting up when she saw him. He crouched down, and she launched herself into his arms. "Lucy." Claire watched the scene with a painful tightness in her chest. It was a perfect, self-contained world of love and devotion, a world shattered by a decision made on a spreadsheet 2 years ago. Steeling herself, she got out of the car and walked towards them, feigning surprise. "Daniel, what a coincidence." He looked up, his initial surprise quickly melting into a warm smile. "Claire, hey, what brings you to this side of the tracks again?" Lucy peeked out from behind her father's legs, her expression a mixture of shyness and curiosity. "This is my daughter, Lucy," Daniel said, gently nudging her forward. "Lucy, this is Ms. Whitmore. She's a friend." Claire knelt to be at the child's level, offering a soft smile. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Lucy. Your dad talks about you all the time." The little girl seemed to decide Claire was trustworthy and held out a piece of folded construction paper. "I made this for you," she said, her voice a small, clear bell. "Daddy said you were a nice lady." Claire's heart clenched. She took the drawing, her fingers brushing the child's. "For me?" Thank you so much. I can't wait to see it." She carefully unfolded the paper. The drawing was rendered in the bold, earnest strokes of an 8-year-old. On the left side stood a smiling stick figure with long, curly brown hair, labeled Mommy. Next to her was a smaller stick figure labeled Me. They were holding hands, but it was the object on the right side of the page that made the air leave Claire's lungs. It was a building, a very large, very specific building, drawn with surprising detail. It was a tower of blue and gray crayon, with rows of rectangular windows and a distinctive, curved glass atrium. At its entrance, it was unmistakable. It was the global headquarters of her company, Anna Ross and her daughter, standing beside the very building where the decision was made to render Anna obsolete. The crayon drawing felt heavier than a tombstone, a child's innocent tribute that served as a brutal indictment. It was a physical manifestation of everything she was trying to forget, a crayon and paper ghost connecting Anna's role as a mother to her fate as an employee. The guilt, which had been a dull ache, now flared into a searing, undeniable imperative. It was no longer enough to feel bad. She had to do something. This new resolve was a potent, driving force. The vague need to assuage her conscience crystallized into a specific goal. She had to help Daniel, not with handouts or empty gestures of charity, but in a meaningful, tangible way that could provide stability for him and for the little girl who had just handed her a drawing of her own crime scene. Her mind, so adept at navigating complex corporate structures, immediately began searching for an angle, an opportunity. She thought of the company's vast network, its vendors, its partners, its subsidiaries. An idea began to form. One of their largest logistics partners, a trucking company named Velocity Freight, kept its regional fleet just outside the city. They were constantly servicing their vehicles, a lucrative and steady stream of work that was currently outsourced to a large, impersonal chain. Claire knew the VP of operations at Velocity, a man named Henderson, with whom she had served on a cross-company efficiency task force last year. The connection was there, a thread waiting to be pulled. She started to believe in a new, more comforting narrative, a red herring for her own heart. She told herself she was doing this because she was beginning to care for Daniel, that she admired his integrity and his dedication as a father. She was drawn to his quiet strength, and this was simply what one person did for another they were growing fond of. This explanation was far more palatable than the raw, ugly truth, that her actions were a frantic, secret attempt at atonement. She was trying to repair a life she had broken, not out of nascent love, but out of a profound and selfish need for redemption. The next day, she made the call. She spoke to Henderson, catching up briefly before steering the conversation. "I'm doing some pro bono consulting for a small local business," she said, the lie smooth and practiced. "A mechanic. The owner is one of the most honest, skilled guys I've ever met. Ross's Auto Repair. I know you use a national chain, but if you're ever looking to support a local business and probably get better, more personal service, you should give him a look." She kept it casual, a simple recommendation, planting a seed without revealing her hand. She knew Henderson was always looking for ways to trim costs and build community goodwill. A few days later, Daniel called her, his voice buzzing with an excitement she had never heard before. "You are not going to believe this," he said. "I just got a call from Velocity Freight. They want me to submit a bid for a service contract on 20 of their local trucks. This, Claire, this could change everything." She closed her eyes, a wave of relief and profound unease washing over her. She had done it. She had helped. And in doing so, she had just woven her lie and her secret that much deeper into the fabric of his life. The Velocity freight contract was transformative. It was a steady, predictable flow of work that stabilized the garage's finances in a way Daniel had only dreamed of. The days of worrying about a slow week or an unexpected bill were replaced by a comfortable rhythm of diagnostics, repairs, and the satisfying hum of a business finding its footing. The new income allowed him to hire a part-time assistant, a retired mechanic named Sal, who handled oil changes and tire rotations, freeing Daniel up for more complex jobs. More importantly, it allowed him to be home for dinner with Lucy every single night. He credited Claire for the change, seeing her simple recommendation as the catalyst for his good fortune. Their friendship deepened over shared coffees during her now regular, coincidental stops, the conversations becoming easier, the silences more comfortable. He was beginning to see past the expensive clothes and the corporate poise to the thoughtful, somewhat lonely woman beneath. For Claire, these moments were a dangerous solace, a taste of a life grounded in authenticity that made her own feel increasingly hollow. Each warm smile from him was both a gift and a turn of the screw, tightening the tension of her secret. The catalyst for the crisis arrived in the form of a memo from Marcus Thorne. It announced the launch of a new, company-wide public relations initiative, Heart of the Community. The campaign's stated goal was to highlight the company's commitment to the people and small businesses that made the city thrive. In reality, Claire knew it was a transparent attempt to soften their corporate image after a recent, bruising patent lawsuit had painted them as a predatory monolith. Marcus, a man who saw human interest stories as another form of leverage, was a master of this kind of cynical branding. He believed that if you told the public you were benevolent enough times, they would eventually start to believe it. He tasked Claire's department, Human Resources, with spearheading the project, arguing that they had their finger on the pulse of the people. This meant that she, the architect of a secret personal deception, was now in charge of manufacturing a public one. The initial brainstorming meeting was an exercise in curated insincerity. Junior PR associates pitched glossy, focus-grouped ideas, sponsoring a youth sports league, a high-profile charity gala. Then a young, ambitious coordinator named Peterson, eager to impress, presented his finding. "I was looking for something with real narrative potential," he announced, clicking to a slide. "A story of resilience, of local entrepreneurship, a single father, a skilled tradesman, who recently landed a major contract with one of our own logistics partners, Velocity Freight." On the screen, a photo of Ross's auto repair appeared, a candid shot pulled from a local business directory. "It's perfect," Peterson continued, oblivious to the blood draining from Claire's face. "It's authentic. It connects directly to our business ecosystem. We feature him, present him with a small business champion grant at a promotional dinner, and we get a story that writes itself." Marcus loved it. It was exactly the kind of bootstraps narrative he was looking for. He turned to Claire, a self-satisfied gleam in his eye. "Whitmore, this is gold. Make it happen. You seem to have a knack for this community outreach stuff." She was trapped. To object would be inexplicable, an act of professional self-sabotage. She could only nod, her voice a thin, reedy thing as she agreed, feeling the steel jaws of the trap she had built for herself snap shut. Approaching Daniel with the proposition was one of the most difficult things Claire had ever had to do. She found him under the hood of a sedan, his hands covered in grease. When she explained the company's offer, the dinner, the grant, the publicity, his initial gratitude for her help morphed into visible discomfort. He straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag, his open, friendly expression replaced by a wary stillness. "A dinner? They want me to… what? Give a speech?" he asked, his brow furrowed. "Claire, I'm a mechanic. I fix cars. I don't stand up in front of a room full of suits and tell my life story so they can feel good about themselves." He wasn't angry, but there was a hard line of integrity in his voice that she hadn't heard before. He felt patronized, like he was being paraded around as some sort of corporate pet project. The tension between them was immediate and palpable. She was pushing him toward the very world of empty gestures and public performance that he instinctively distrusted, the world that had, in its own way, broken his wife. "It's a great opportunity, Daniel," she argued, the words feeling false even to her. "The grant is $10,000. Think of what you could do for the garage, for Lucy." The mention of his daughter made him hesitate, which only made Claire feel worse. She was using his love for his child to manipulate him into a situation that put her own secret at terrible risk. In the end, after a tense negotiation where Claire convinced Marcus to drop the speech requirement, Daniel reluctantly agreed to a simple check presentation and photo opportunity at the dinner. He was doing it for the money, for Lucy's future, but his reluctance hung between them, a new and uncomfortable distance. He felt she didn't understand his aversion to being put on display, and she was terrified he would finally see the truth of who she was. Not a friend, but the ghost who had signed his wife's termination papers. The night of the promotion dinner was a surreal nightmare. It was held in a downtown hotel ballroom, a cavern of crystal chandeliers and starched white tablecloths. Daniel, looking deeply uncomfortable in a borrowed suit, stood beside her as Marcus delivered a saccharine speech about corporate responsibility. The moment came for the presentation. They were called to the stage, the applause of the crowd, a polite, distant roar in Claire's ears. She stood beside Daniel under the hot stage lights, forcing a smile as the cameras flashed. He shook Marcus's hand, accepted the oversized check, and looked out into the sea of anonymous faces with an expression of stoic endurance. A corporate photographer motioned for them to stand closer together for one last picture. In that moment, with the camera lens pointed at them like the barrel of a gun, Claire was acutely aware of the chasm between the public image being created, the benevolent executive and the grateful small business owner, and the devastating reality of their connection. The flashbulb went off, capturing the lie in perfect, high-resolution detail. The following morning, that photograph was the centerpiece of the company-wide internal newsletter, blasted to the inboxes of all 12,000 employees. An older woman in the accounting department, who had worked with Anna Ross for years and had attended her wedding, opened the email. She looked at the picture of her boss, Claire Whitmore, and the honored mechanic. Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned closer to her screen, a cold shock of recognition dawning on her face. "My God," she whispered to the quiet of her cubicle. "That's Anna's husband." The weeks following the promotional dinner settled into a new, promising normal. The grant money had allowed Daniel to invest in a state-of-the-art diagnostic machine, and the steady work from Velocity Freight had brought a sense of security he hadn't felt since before Anna died. For the first time, he felt he was building something that would last, a legacy for Lucy. His friendship with Claire had become a quiet cornerstone of this new life. She would stop by the garage, her presence a calm, intelligent counterpoint to the clang of metal and the smell of oil. They talked about everything and nothing: books, Lucy's progress in school, the absurdities of city bureaucracy. He found himself admiring her sharp mind and her unexpected warmth, a warmth that seemed to exist in defiance of the pristine, untouchable world she came from. A fragile, unspoken affection was beginning to grow between them, the kind that feels both terrifying and inevitable. He was starting to imagine a future that wasn't defined solely by his loss, but by the possibility of a new connection. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, an innocuous single line in his inbox that would act as a detonator. The sender was someone he didn't know, a name, Jacob Finch, with no company affiliation. The subject line simply read, "Question about a story." Daniel almost deleted it, assuming it was spam. But something made him click it open. The message was brief. "Mr. Ross," it began. "My name is Jacob Finch. I'm an independent journalist researching a story about the human cost of corporate downsizing. An anonymous source recently came forward about a potential cover-up at a major pharmaceutical company 2 years ago, involving an employee who allegedly took her own life shortly after being terminated during a mass layoff. Your wife's name was mentioned. I know this is incredibly sensitive, but I was hoping you might be willing to speak with me." Daniel's blood ran cold. Took her own life? Anna's death was a tragic accident. The police report was clear. She lost control of her car on a wet road. It was a horrible, random act of fate. This journalist was mistaken, chasing a ghost, a sick, sensationalized lie. He was about to write a curt, angry reply when he saw there was an attachment to the email. It was a single, scanned PDF file, its name a string of numbers. He clicked on it, his heart beginning to pound a heavy, painful rhythm against his ribs. The document was a partially redacted internal memo. The letterhead was from the company Anna had worked for. The subject was Project Headcount Reduction, Phase 1. It was a list of employee numbers, departments, and termination dates. He scanned the page, his eyes blurring, and then he saw it, a line that hadn't been fully blacked out. Department, R&D, termination. Effective, October 23rd. Anna's department. The exact date she had come home, her face pale and drawn, telling him she had quit her job to pursue something less stressful. She hadn't been laid off, she had insisted. It had been her choice. It was a lie. She had been protecting him, protecting her own pride. At the very bottom of the page, below the columns of names and numbers, were 2 signature lines. The first, for the department head, was redacted. But the second, under the title HR Approval, was perfectly clear, an elegant, decisive script. Claire Whitmore. The name stared up at him from the screen, a betrayal so profound it stole the air from his lungs. His Claire, the woman who had shown up at his garage like a guardian angel, the friend who listened to his stories about Anna with such empathy, the consultant who had so generously helped him secure the Velocity contract. It all coalesced in one blinding, horrific flash of understanding. Her kindness wasn't kindness, it was penance. Her interest wasn't friendship, it was surveillance. The Velocity contract wasn't a lucky break, it was blood money, a secret payment from a guilty conscience. Every shared coffee, every smile, every word of encouragement was a lie, a carefully constructed facade to hide the monumental truth that she was the one who had shattered his world. The feeling wasn't rage, it was a deep, hollow emptiness, as if the entire foundation of the past few months had been vaporized beneath his feet, leaving him in a freefall. He didn't call. He didn't text. He drove. He left Sal in charge of the garage and got into his truck, the scanned document a burning image in his mind. He drove downtown, into the heart of the city he so rarely visited, and parked in the public garage across from the gleaming glass tower she had helped his daughter draw in crayon. He walked into the cavernous, marble-floored lobby, his grease-stained work boots and worn jeans, an open challenge to the corporate serenity of the space. The security guard at the front desk tried to stop him, but Daniel walked past him as if he weren't there, his eyes fixed on the elevator bank. He didn't know her floor, but the name on the corporate directory was all he needed. Claire Whitmore, SVP, Head of Human Resources. He rode the elevator up, the silence amplifying the frantic, broken rhythm of his own heart. He found her office at the end of a long, quiet hallway, carpeted in muted gray. Her door was open. She was on the phone, her back to him, looking out the massive window at the city below. She was in her element, a queen in her glass castle. "I'll have the projections for you by 5, she was saying, her voice calm and authoritative. Then she turned, sensing his presence. The professional mask on her face dissolved into shock, then fear, when she saw him standing in her doorway. "Daniel," she breathed, her hand flying to her throat as she quickly ended the call. "What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" He walked slowly into the room, the scent of his garage a foreign contaminant in the filtered air. He didn't say a word. He just pulled out his phone, pulled up the image of the document, and held it out for her to see. He watched her eyes as she recognized the signature. He saw the last vestiges of her composure crumble, saw the guilt she had been hiding for so long finally surface, raw and undeniable. "You lied to me," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was an accusation, but it sounded like a death sentence. And in that moment, Claire knew there were no more exits, no more deceptions. The lie had run its course. The confession came out in a torrent, a flood of words held back for 2 agonizing years. She told him everything. She told him about Marcus Thorne's directive, about the list of names, about how Anna had just been a line on a page. She confessed to seeing the photo in his office and realizing what she had done. She admitted that the Velocity contract, the friendship, all of it, was born from a desperate, selfish need to quiet her own conscience. She didn't make excuses or try to shift the blame. She stood before him, stripped of all her corporate armor, and laid the ugly truth at his feet. "I am so sorry, Daniel," she whispered, tears finally tracing paths down her face. "I never wanted to hurt you more." He listened to it all without flinching, his expression unreadable. The warm, kind man she had come to know was gone, replaced by a stranger whose heart she had just broken for a second time. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the opulent office. The affection that had started to bloom between them was now dead, poisoned by the truth. He looked at her one last time, his gaze filled not with anger, but with a profound and bottomless sorrow. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the wreckage of her confession. The article appeared 2 days later, published on a well-regarded but fiercely independent online journalism platform. It landed not with a bombastic explosion, but with the chilling, silent efficiency of a digital guillotine. The headline was a masterpiece of brutal simplicity. "Director fired ailing employee 3 days before her death." Jacob Finch's piece was meticulously researched, built upon the foundation of the leaked memo, and corroborated by 2 other anonymous sources from within the company. It told the story of Anna Ross not as a statistic of corporate restructuring, but as a dedicated employee who, while secretly battling a serious illness, was terminated by a company she had given 6 years of her life to. And at the center of the narrative, named and quoted from official corporate filings, was Claire Whitmore, the Senior Vice President of Human Resources, the woman whose signature had sealed Anna's fate. The photograph from the promotional dinner was used as the article's banner image. There she was, smiling under the stage lights, standing next to the grieving husband of the woman she had fired. It was an image of such staggering hypocrisy that it required no caption. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The story was a shark in the corporate waters, and the scent of blood was irresistible. It was picked up by major news outlets, the narrative of the heartless executive and the virtuous working man, a perfect, ready-made morality play for the 24-hour news cycle. The public's condemnation was a tidal wave of righteous fury. Claire's name became synonymous with corporate callousness. At the office, the chill was absolute. Colleagues who had laughed with her in meetings, now avoided her gaze in the hallway. The whispers stopped when she entered a room. Marcus Thorne, ever the pragmatist, acted swiftly to cauterize the wound. His public statement expressed deep regret and shock, and emphasized that an internal review was underway. It was a clinical corporate execution. Claire was no longer a valued executive. She was a liability to the brand, a public relations crisis that had to be managed and, ultimately, excised. Her career, a life's work built over 2 decades of ambition and sacrifice, had been dismantled in less than 48 hours. For Daniel, the exposure was a different kind of violation. He awoke one morning to find a news van parked across the street from his garage, a reporter and a cameraman setting up on the public sidewalk. They descended on him the moment he stepped outside, shouting questions, their microphones like weapons thrust toward his face. "Mr. Ross, how does it feel to know your wife was fired just before she died? Do you feel you were manipulated by Ms. Whitmore? Are you planning to sue the company?" They saw him as a character in their story, the tragic widower, the face of the victim. They wanted his anger, his grief, his tears. They wanted a soundbite that would bleed. But Daniel refused to perform for them. He gave them nothing. He looked through them, his face a mask of stone, and walked back inside, locking the garage door behind him. He unplugged his phone and drew the blinds in the small apartment upstairs, creating a sanctuary for him and Lucy against the siege outside. His silence was not an act of forgiveness or an incisive middle ground. It was a fierce, protective act. He would not allow them to turn Anna's memory into a spectacle. He would not protect Claire from the consequences of her actions, but he would not participate in her public crucifixion either. He would not lie or embellish his pain for their ratings. His loss was his, and it was not for sale. The pressure from the board of directors was unbearable, and Marcus delivered the final verdict in a meeting that lasted less than 10 minutes. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a formality. Her resignation was expected, effective immediately. Claire sat in her glass-walled office for the last time, the sprawling city view that had once made her feel powerful, now feeling like a mockery. She typed a short, formal letter, the words stark and impersonal. Stripped of her title, her access badge deactivated, she was suddenly an outsider in the world she had commanded. Packing her personal belongings into a single cardboard box felt like an archaeological dig through a life that no longer belonged to her. A framed university degree, a leadership award, a small, potted orchid, artifacts of a forgotten civilization. Each object was a reminder of the person she had been, a person who believed in order, in control, in a clear and linear path to success. That person was gone, replaced by a woman adrift in the wreckage of her own choices. Before leaving the city for good, before starting the long, uncertain journey of figuring out who she was without her career, there was one last thing she had to do. She drove to the garage late that night, long after the news vans had packed up and retreated. The street was quiet, bathed in the lonely orange glow of the streetlights. A single dim light was on in the window above the garage, a beacon in the darkness. She knew she couldn't speak to him. There were no words left that could bridge the chasm between them. Her presence would only be an intrusion, another selfish act. She wasn't there for his forgiveness. She was there for his daughter. She sat in her car for a long time before taking out a simple blank note card. Her hands trembled as she wrote, the words not an explanation, but a simple, heartfelt apology addressed to a child. For Lucy, it began. "I'm so very sorry for the noise and the cameras. I hope you and your dad find peace again soon." She didn't sign her name. She walked to the mailbox at the edge of the property, the metal cool and solid beneath her fingers. She slipped the card inside, the small sound of it landing at the bottom echoing in the profound silence of the night. It was an inadequate gesture, a whisper against a hurricane, but it was the only honest thing she had left to give. She got back in her car and drove away, not once looking in the rearview mirror. The storm of public opinion, like all storms, eventually passed, moving on to find new coastlines to erode. The news vans disappeared from Daniel's street, and his phone fell silent. The world forgot about the woman who was fired and the man she left behind. But in the quiet aftermath, Daniel was left to navigate the wreckage. The anger he had felt in Claire's office had cooled into a heavy, lingering sorrow. He found no satisfaction in her downfall, no justice in the destruction of her life. There was only a profound emptiness, a sense that the truth had been told, but the story was still wrong. He and Lucy existed in this quiet limbo, their days marked by the familiar rhythms of school and work, but an essential piece of their nascent healing had been fractured. The garage, once a place of solace and purpose, now felt haunted by the ghost of a friendship that had been built on a devastating lie. The silver sedan, which Claire had left behind in her hasty departure from the city, sat in the corner of the bay, a silent, monolithic monument to it all. It had to go. One quiet Saturday, while Lucy was at a friend's house, Daniel resolved to finally deal with the car. He would give it a thorough cleaning, top up the fluids, and put it up for sale. He needed to erase the last physical trace of Claire Whitmore from his life in order to move on. He worked methodically, his movements slow and deliberate. He vacuumed the pristine carpets, wiped down the leather seats, and polished the dashboard until it gleamed. It felt less like preparing a car for sale and more like performing a final rite. His last task was to clear out the glove box. He pulled out the thick owner's manual and the stack of old service records. As he ran his rag along the back of the compartment, his fingers brushed against the edge of a piece of paper. It was a single, sealed envelope, tucked deep inside, as if to ensure it would not be easily found. He pulled it out. It was made of thick, cream-colored stationery, and on the front, in his wife's elegant, familiar script, were 3 words: "For my boss." His heart stopped. For a long moment, he could only stare at the envelope, at the graceful loops of Anna's handwriting. A letter from the past, an impossible communication from beyond the grave. His hands trembled as he carefully broke the seal. The letter inside was written on matching stationery, dated the morning of her accident. He sank onto the passenger seat of the car, the scent of leather and Claire's phantom perfume rising around him, and began to read. "To the woman I have come to respect as my boss," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I did not find the courage to tell you this in person, and for that I am sorry. There is something you should know, and I felt it was my duty to ensure this reached you one way or another. For the past 6 months, I have been unwell. The doctors have given it a long, complicated name, but the truth of it is simple. My body is fighting a battle it will not win. I have kept it a secret from everyone, including my husband. I did not want their pity, and more than anything, I did not want my daughter's last memories of me to be clouded by sickness. I wanted to be her mother, not her patient. You were recently asked to make difficult decisions about our department. I know that these things are not personal, but a matter of business. I am writing to tell you that I was planning to resign on the very day the news was delivered. My time is more precious than a salary now, and I wanted to spend what is left of it with my family. Perhaps you will think this is a strange letter to write, but I wanted to thank you. Over the last few months, when my energy was low and my focus was not what it should have been, you never once made me feel inadequate. You gave me space, you trusted my work, and you treated me with a professional dignity that I will always be grateful for. Please, do not carry any guilt over the decision you had to make. It was a corporate necessity, but for me, It was a release I was too cowardly to ask for myself. Whatever happens, know that my leaving this company was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of my final, most important chapter. With sincere gratitude, Anna Ross. Daniel read the letter once, then twice, the words blurring through the hot tears that welled in his eyes. The entire narrative he had built around Anna's death, the one the world had seized upon, crumbled into dust. She wasn't simply a victim. She was a woman of immense strength and quiet courage, making an impossible choice, trying to protect the people she loved in the only way she knew how. And Claire. Claire had not been a heartless executioner. She had been the unwitting instrument of a fate that Anna was already walking toward. The carefully constructed walls of his anger, his betrayal, his righteousness, they all came crashing down, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth of a tragedy far more complex and human than he had ever imagined. The catharsis was a painful, shuddering release, a wave of grief for his wife's secret burden, and a profound, aching sorrow for the injustice he had done to Claire. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had to find her. It took him 3 days. Her apartment was empty, her digital footprint erased. He finally drove to the corporate headquarters, not as an accuser, but as a petitioner. He found the young PR coordinator, Peterson, the one who had first proposed featuring his garage. He showed him the letter. The young man's face went pale as he read it, and an hour later, he slipped Daniel a piece of paper with a forwarding address for a small town 3 hours north, a quiet place of rolling hills and main streets that looked like they hadn't changed in 50 years. He found her working at the town's public library, shelving books, her movements quiet and contained. The sharp, tailored suits were gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jeans. When she looked up and saw him standing at the end of the aisle, she froze, a book clutched to her chest like a shield. She looked smaller, stripped of her corporate armor, but her eyes held a quiet resilience. He didn't speak. He walked toward her and held out the letter. She took it with a trembling hand, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. He watched as her face went through a storm of emotions: confusion, disbelief, dawning recognition, and finally, a deep, soul-shattering grief. She sank onto a small stool between the shelves, and he sat beside her. They read it again, together, their shoulders almost touching. In the hushed sanctuary of the library, surrounded by the silent stories of 1,000 lives, they finally cried. They cried for Anna's secret pain, for the 2 years of misplaced guilt and anger, for the friendship that had been born from a lie, but had somehow touched upon a deeper truth. When the tears subsided, a new, clean silence settled between them. "She was so brave," Claire whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I had no idea." "Neither did I," Daniel said, his own voice heavy. "I'm sorry, Claire, for everything. They didn't fix everything in that moment, but they laid a new foundation, one built not on secrets, but on a shared, complicated truth." The following week, she came back to the city. The garage was waiting. The work was slow, starting not with cars, but with conversations. One evening, sitting on the same worn stools where their friendship had begun, she had an idea. "What if we started a fund?" she said, her eyes alight with a purpose he hadn't seen before. "For people like Anna, people who lose their jobs and have nowhere to turn. We could offer financial help, retraining, counseling. We could call it Anna's Bench, like a place to rest and figure out what's next." The idea was perfect. It was a way to honor Anna's memory, not by looking back at the injustice, but by creating a legacy of compassion. Daniel would run the garage, the heart of the operation, while Claire, with her sharp mind and now humbled understanding of the corporate world, would build the foundation. The silver sedan was never sold. It became their first official asset, a free loaner car for anyone the foundation helped, a tangible piece of rolling kindness. One afternoon, as Claire was working on the foundation's paperwork in the small office, she looked up and saw Daniel leaning against a workbench, a faint, genuine smile on his face. On his wrist, the frayed leather cord Anna had given him was a constant, quiet reminder, not just of a great loss, but of the enduring power of truth, forgiveness, and a love strong enough to build a new world from the ashes of the old.